Can we start? Okay, let's start. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to, well, officially this is Pupin 214, but unofficially to the Department of Civil Engineering and Engineering Mechanics. This is a special event that we have every year. It's the annual Mindlin lecture offered by the Department of Civil Engineering and Engineering Mechanics. And today is my privilege to introduce a dear friend of mine, Professor Roberto Ballarini from University of Boston. Professor Ballarini, the name says Italian, but he was born in the United States. No, Italy. But his own education, well, he's Italian. So he's Italian, but his education was done in the United States. He graduated from City University of New York and received your Bachelor of Science, Bachelor of Engineering, if I'm correct. And then he moved to Northwestern, where he received a Master of Science and a PhD. After Northwestern, I think 1986, if I'm correct, you moved to Case Western University, and he was there for about 20 years. After that, he moved to the University of Minnesota, and as the department chair. And then recently he moved to the University of Houston as the Thomas and Laura Su Professor and Department Chair. The publication record, the awards that he has received is a quite long list, but he is among the top of them. The one that he really relates directly to this lecture is that he is the recipient of the 2019 ASE Engineering Mechanics Institute Ray Mindlin Medal. And this one is the connections with this department. Ray Mindlin, for those students who are here that don't know about the history of this department, Ray Mindlin probably was the pinnacle of this department in the 50s, 60s, 70s. This was one of the major contributors in the field of theory of elasticity and engineering mechanics of materials, plates theory. So he has done tremendous contribution to the field of engineering mechanics. And today, honestly, I could not think of a better person to deliver the lecture than Roberto, because his work is really fundamental, is really theoretical, on the same line that Professor Mindlin would have done and he would have liked to see here today. Roberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the really generous introduction. It's really an honor to be here. I visited Columbia several times over the last decade, and it's always very, very nice to be here. As you said, I'm a city college boy. I was not able to afford going to Columbia when I was an undergraduate, but it's great to return as a speaker. Anyway, today what I'll talk about is the work that I did with Gianni for the University of Parma a few years ago. It's different than some of the things I talked about in the past here at Columbia, which were very, I would say, definitely very accessible to the general audience. This will be a little bit more fundamental, but the reason I chose this particular talk is because it's in the spirit of Ray Mindlin, who's a great statistician and did very, very fundamental work. So basically, I apologize ahead of time for some of the details I'll go through relatively quickly, because I don't want to bog ourselves down with some of the mathematics, even some of the equations which I've listed. I'm not going to go over them too detailed, but just get the general flavor of what we did and why we tried to do it. So again, it's really, really special. I would never think many years ago that I was able not only to give a lecture at Columbia, but somehow to come and give such a lecture. I had no idea who Ray Mindlin was back then. But I looked at my academic great-grandfather, Ray Mindlin, here in the middle, but it turns out that he also had a tremendous pedigree, if you will. You know, he had worked with Arthur Talbot, which many of you may know in the structures area and materials. Then actually Harold Westergaard at Harvard was one of his lineage, if you will. Then Ray Mindlin, then Lawrence Goodman, who was at Minnesota, he advised my advisor, Leon Keir, and this little pithy guy here is me. And I just hope that Ray Mindlin's not rolling in his grave, me giving this lecture. I hope that I will do him a little bit of proud. So the paper, if those of you are interested and you're keen on fracture mechanics and solid state defects and such things, you could read the paper in JMPS that came out a few years ago that I did with Johnny Royer, who's a really brilliant guy, by the way. It was a great pleasure. The story behind this lecture was that I moved from Minnesota to Houston. My wife was still in Minnesota. He visited me for 5 months. His wife was in Italy. So we would just play around with elasticity in the evenings by ourselves and eventually go out for a little beer and stuff. But we ended up publishing a few papers on very, very fundamental topics of fracture. So this one is on the idea of configurational forces, which I'll define in a few minutes. The motivation for this work, again, was just playing around. It was, for those of you who are familiar with mechanics and so-called energetic forces, they're kind of abstract. They're not as intuitive as Newtonian forces, right? If I push on this table, you kind of infer there's a force and such. But there's also something called forces, which were pioneered by Eshelby, known as configurational forces, which are basically things that happen that are driven by basically more favorable energy states. So if you have something that moves from here to here, even though there's not a Newtonian force on this object, but it may want to move from here to here, such as a dislocation, for example, or a crack tip, the idea that it moves from here to here, the same way that we talk about the work or variation in energy being like a force times a movement, which everybody's familiar with, there's something called an energetic force, where this is not really a Newtonian force, and this is not like a movement of a displacement of a beam, but it could be perhaps the movement of a dislocation or a movement of a crack tip. So the idea is you know what the energy change is, you know how much something has moved. So an analogy to this thing, we call this a force. Is that clear? But it's not a real force. It's not a Newtonian force. What I'll talk about today is we discovered, very similar to what Davide Bigoni did in Italy for structural mechanics, that you could actually reconcile these kind of forces on materials of substance which have no net force, no Newtonian force, with the Newtonian force. I'll show you then that these little constructs actually have a Newtonian force. Okay, that's the idea. So again, the idea is just for fun, for pedagogical reason, and just the fundamental, the ontology of where these things come from. So if you go back to the history of Newtonian forces versus energy-based theories, there were like different clubs. So for those of you who are taking courses in dynamics and you talk about D'Alembert forces and all these kind of things, this camp basically says the forces are obscure, they're metaphysical beings capable of nothing but spreading darkness over a science that's clear by itself. Right? You don't need forces. You can talk about science that we know through energies and whatnot. And then Roberto wrote, we speak of forces only to conceal our ignorance, right? Introducing the concept of force. Carnot, right? The Carnot cycle, thermodynamics. An obscure and metaphysical notion that of force. At the other side, though, Thomson and Tate, they had a treatise in the 1800s. Every attempt that has been made to supersede the Newtonian laws have ended in utter failure. So there's still, in the philosophical of mechanics discussions still talk about which are more favorable. Of course, you have to be liberal. They're both different approaches, right? They're both very good and they're both very different approaches. What I'll talk about today is to show you how you can reconcile some of these. So just a little bit of history of why I like what I do. I'm a fracture mechanician. Ray did not work much in fracture, but he did a tremendous amount of all the different areas. So we're kind of extending his legacy a little bit. So I do see cracks everywhere. Unfortunately, you can see them when I get on the plane. I start looking for little cracks everywhere. But I am something that's very interested in cracks because fracture mechanics, I'm very passionate about it because it combines mathematics, physics, chemistry, sometimes biology, and some of the work we do in fracture biostructures. It's really a field that demands a lot of knowledge and learning, if you will, from the different fields. In fact, I can't get away from it. Even when I try to go away on vacation, a few years and years ago, I was in Vancouver Island with my wife, who's here, and we were sitting in this lodge in Strathcona Park, and then in Tofino, and I wanted to relax, get away from work. I said, okay, here's a fireplace, there's some muffins, some nice tea. Let me open a book and read and relax. And what do I see when I open up the book? Fracture mechanics. Right, so this is a book by Hilary Stewart, which I'll mention. It actually fits into the talk. The Cedar Indians basically used these cedar trees in this temperate rainforest, which is on the east side of Vancouver, on the west side of Vancouver Island, to do everything for their homes, for their clothing. They made houses out of these things. They used the bark to make clothing and whatnot. But if you look at this, it was kind of an interesting book to open because I teach a course in fracture where in the next 2 slides, it covers all the topics in my course, even though they didn't go to school and learn fracture mechanics. So for example, if they wanted to fracture a plank to get it so they could use it to build perhaps a house, they would put perhaps a rod here, but they knew about what's called crack growth stability. It turns out in this configuration, if you start fracturing here, and the crack starts extending, the crack stops because this is what's called a stable configuration. The energy release rate is a negative function, so you need to keep on driving it to make the crack propagate. So what they're doing is they're moving along here, which is intuitive, to keep the crack from growing. And again, you can explain this mathematically now through energy arguments and stability arguments. They also knew about things like static fatigue, which occurs in glass and ceramics, where they may want to perhaps, again, fracture the same kind of plank. So what they do is they put a rod there, they wait, freeze, thaw, environment, water attacking the crack tip and all of that, and then a few months later or a few weeks later, this thing will crack all the way to the other side, and they have what they want. This is what we call today static fatigue or stress corrosion cracking. So they knew a lot about these things through intuition. And this is one of the motivations for the work that we have today. I basically favor physical intuition to study problems. So again, they did not go to graduate school to learn fracture. They learn from experience and gain insights. Now we do have a lot of methodology, so I always talk to my students, because there's different types of students, and I favor myself, and I hope that they buy into it, to always try to understand physically what's going on when you have, all this mathematics that you're doing and all this computation that you're doing. So this is just a message to the young faculty and the young students. In fact, it goes back, you told me that Enrico Fermi lectured in this hall, right, or in this building. So there's an old story by Enrico Fermi to Freeman Dyson, which many of you know is a very famous physicist, basically, a mathematician. When Dyson was at Cornell in the 50s or something like that, he wanted to show some work that he did to Enrico Fermi, who was very busy in Chicago developing all sorts of ideas there. And he basically sent the paper, and then he took the train from Ithaca to Chicago, and Enrico gave a few minutes of his time, and Enrico was a man of few words and quite blunt. He said there are 2 ways of doing calculation in theoretical physics. He said, one way, and this is the way I prefer it, is to have a clear physical picture of the process that you're trying to calculate. The other way is to have a precise and self-consistent mathematical formalism, because you have neither, right? And the work turns out that it was all wrong, but at the same time, he was very honest, and Dyson abandoned this work, continued doing other work which is very influential and seminal, and became very, very, very famous because this crazy Italian guy told him that what they're doing here is garbage. It turns out that he was basically curve-fitting things in a vacuum. But anyway, so again, this is what I'm trying to stress here, that we're trying to look at things very, very fundamentally, but at the same time, in the spirit of Ray Mindlin. Ray Mindlin did a lot of very fundamental work, but all of this stuff is used, whether it's vibrations of piezoelectric plates, some of the models that he developed now on strain gradient theories of material behavior. Of course, he won the National Medal of Merit for his proximity fuse work during the war, which was one of the things that actually helped us win the war. So I'll talk about a little bit of an outline here. I usually don't have an outline, but this talk is a little bit, I don't want it to become incoherent, so I'll tell you a little bit about the path we're taking. I'll talk about what a configurational force on the crack tip. This is the so-called J integral. This energetic force, by the way, are what I call Eshelby forces, okay? So these are known as Eshelby forces. Eshelby was a giant also on the other side of the pond. So I'll talk about configurational forces on dislocations, the so-called Peach-Kohler force, to look at how dislocations move in solids. And I'll talk about the toy models. Again, we try to look at very simple models first before we go on to more complex models. And I'll talk a little bit about the introduction to these things. But what I want to do is I want to give credit to my colleague here in a minute, which is configurational forces on elastic structures by Davide Bigoni in Trento, which does some really beautiful experiments and simple models on what I call structural mechanics. Things having to do with beams, rods, columns, and whatever, to show how configurational forces actually exist in those structures, even though we usually describe them by talking about the energy, and the energy, the favorite configurations of energy. So here's Davide, and of course he's Italian, so half play and half would go to eat good food and have good minds, right? And for those of you, again, that are interested. He has very beautiful videos for education. He's a great instructor. I also try to champion really good people. And if you go to YouTube, you can see a lot of these experiments that he's developed to look at all different topics, including buckling, cracks, all sorts of things that are really neat. And I'll talk about those today. So, when you get older, you also get more liberal with your students when they make mistakes that, you think on an exam, how did they make that? That's not supposed to be there and all of that. But let's see what we can do here. So imagine that you have a very simple problem that you studied as an undergraduate. You have a cantilever beam with a force, and it's a fixed wall, right? So then, if a student were to write, okay, here's my reaction, here's the force here, that would be correct, right? Vertical equilibrium, force here, force up. And of course, you have that moment equilibrium, which is a force here, times the distance, which is this moment here. But what if they put this big force S there? You would say, wrong, right? There's no axial force in the problem because there's no applied axial force. Well, maybe the student understands things deeper than we do. And he says, you know what? There's got to be something there because I know something's going to happen if that force is not balanced out, right? So let's assume now that there is a force there, S and K. And the reason we don't think about this force being there, because we're always doing equilibrium by considering like a force here, a displacement here, so these energies are just related to the compliance of the structure. But what if we allow the distance that this beam is inside this sleeve to be a variable? In other words, this is a certain configuration, right? But if you move this, if this moved a little bit, you would have a different configuration, right? That's what you mean by a configurational force. It's a force related to driving from one configuration to another. So I argue that there is a force there. There's actually a Newtonian force there, cheating a little bit, even though you would not think there's one. And it's very simple energetically. You could do this again as a homework problem. Write the energy now, where you have several degrees of freedom, including the movement here, but also allow this movement of this rod to be 1 degree of freedom. So if you write that energy, I won't go through any of the math, by the way, and don't ask too many questions on the details of the math, we can talk about it afterwards. The energy here is basically the bending energy in this being the first part, but there's also this force that I'm allowing to be in the system times some movement of that force, right? The work times the distance of that force. If you just apply the principle of stationary potential energy, you need that in order to actually satisfy the equation, because if you take the derivative with respect to now not the displacement movement, the virtual displacement, but the virtual movement of this rod, is that clear? Then you actually find that that force is actually m squared over 2b, which we know from our strength of materials, there's basically an energy in there. So what this is saying is the following, that there's a tendency, this is the way I'm going to explain it, for this system to be driven to a different equilibrium length, unless something is done, which is this force right here. Okay, so this is the so-called configurational force, or actually force. I'm going to show you an experiment in a few minutes, which you don't have to go to school to understand, but it's this thing. So what Davide did is generalize this to an angled beam to make it a little bit more interesting, a little bit more meaty. And what you do now, you do the same problem. This problem, again, has a lot of mathematics because you're solving the elastica in a curvilinear system. But if you do that, and you apply a force here now, again, it's a smooth collar, you allow this S to be there, either in that direction or the opposite direction. And of course, if it's a smooth collar, then the force will be normal to the beam. And what you do is you solve this problem, you go through all the math, and you find, using the same idea, you write the energy, you take the variation of the energy with respect to the movement of this rod, and you find that there's this force S, which again is m squared over 2b, divided by the cosine of the angle, and it turns out that S could be either greater than 0, it could be less than 0, or it could be 0. What that would mean now is that in order for this to be in equilibrium, well, if S is 0, if this loading is such that this thing is horizontal, it just stays there even though it's a smooth collar. It won't move. But if S is greater than 0, okay, that means that this collar wants to slide inside this tunnel. It's got rollers and it's frictionless. On the other hand, if it goes too much, what happens, this thing wants to be ejected like an arrow. And this idea is that, of course, it makes sense from a structural engineering point of view that this would happen based on some energy minimization, but you could think about it, if you want, if you allow yourself to think about it as there's actually this force that's trying to push it out, or it's a force that's trying to pull it in. That's the so-called configuration force. And I'll show you the videos, of course. These are, now, that's one way of doing it. So I'm going to show you 3 different ways of thinking about it, which is the ways we also did it with the crack problems and the dislocations. You could then visualize this in a very interesting way, in a limiting mathematical way. Imagine that you had the same problem I started with a few slides ago. But now instead of having the rod being in a smooth collar, which is an infinitesimal distance, allow it to have a delta. Allow that collar to have a certain thickness, if you will. Then, of course, you can see right away, if this is smooth, it has this component of force R, but then this could be decomposed into this force, and this would be the configurational force. Okay, so the idea is you solve this problem again. It's a beam theory problem for the elastica. It has a lot of algebra. But when you do that, you find, okay, allow myself to perturb the system by delta, solve the problem again, take the limit as delta goes back to the initial primitive configuration. And if you do all the mathematics, it turns out that even when you make delta go back to 0, the component r sine theta, which is this horizontal configurational force, does not disappear. Okay, you actually get m squared over 2b again. So you can either see it from a potential energy derivative, where you put the configuration as part of the degrees of freedom, or you can look at it as a perturbation on the elastica, making it go back to 0, this thing will not disappear. So there's these configurational forces hidden everywhere in the problem. So if you look at Davide, he has the same hairstyle I do. You don't need his sound, don't worry about his sound. He's got beautiful experiments on YouTube and it's that. So now it's horizontal, so it's an equilibrium. The S will be 0. But now see it went in because that S had to be the other way.
Can I ask you something?
Sure.
I have curiosity, but I think there is friction there.
Well, these are rollers. These are rollers. Yeah, so mathematically we're assuming frictionless. And then what he did in this experiment is rollers which are very frictionless. You measure the forces. So there's rollers all over here, and then sometimes you could actually hold it and measure that force. You could actually hold it and measure that force that you need with a load cell. But the idea, though, is intuitive that this beam will fall out because it's a frictionless thing, or it will go in, or the perfect equilibrium is stays there. Okay, that's the idea. S is either greater than 0, less than 0, or so the one that you saw when he started, there was no friction, but it was a configuration where this was horizontal, and if you calculate it, this configurational force is 0. There's nothing driving it out or pulling it in, but if you have this one which he showed, this one, in order for it to not slide through, you would have to have a physical force being pushed here, a Newtonian force. Or if this is in this configuration, this will pull out, like he showed he did, unless you hold it here. And that's what I'm going to talk about fracture mechanics later, that there's always a driving force, like you said, and a resistance. In this case, there's no resistance, so it either happens or it doesn't happen. Later on, when we talk about fracture toughness, or the barriers required to move dislocations, there's this driving force similar to this, and there's some kind of material resistance which prevents that from happening. And only when one becomes large enough does this happen. So in this case, there is no friction, so there's no restraint either to go out or to go in, but the driving force, if you will, is this S. And of course, it's not there, right? There's no force, it's a configurational force. So let's go on now. So then let's talk about now configurational forces on crack tips. So for those of you who don't know what the J integral is or the energy release rate, then we'll talk about the Peach-Kohler force on dislocations. So if you have a crack in a body, it has a surface and it could change its length. The normal direction across the crack front is delta L, which is the change in length in this direction, but it could also change all around. But if you do, let's say, just a simple 2D problem, you could show that the variation in strain energy is basically, if you have a variation in displacement and generalized displacement, and this is the generalized applied force, when the crack moves, this is not good enough, right? This is what we usually deal with structural engineering. We basically have the variation energy associated with some virtual work of the loads. But if you allow yourself to have a degree of freedom as the crack length, if you will, then there's another contribution, otherwise you won't account for all the energy, which is the energy release rate times the variation in the crack length. That's what I meant before. You allow the displacement of the structure and the crack tip location to be degrees of freedom. And then if you look at the change of potential energy, if you do a Legendre transformation, you can write it as the displacement times the variation in load, but you still have this form here. And then there's something called the J integral, which is the Eshelby momentum tensor integrated. Again, I won't go through all the details. This J integral, which is a very abstract thing, which Eshelby came up with as the driving force. J would be the Eshelby driving force for a crack tip. It turns out that this thing is the same as this energy release rate here. Okay, and when a crack propagates, this so-called driving force, whether you use this or this, has to be large enough to overcome the material's resistance to crack propagation, which is the fracture toughness. So the energetic force, or the configurational force in the crack, is the so-called J integral, which is related to the energy release rate. And when this thing becomes a critical value, like the surface energy of a perfectly brittle material, to gamma, the crack will extend. And we need to know what these are in a structure to assess whether a crack will propagate. So again, this is basically what the driving force is for a crack. It's the J integral of the energy release rate. So again, it's seen here in the figure here, right? So if you have a low displacement curve from one crack length to another, crack length L, you have this stiffness. If you have crack length that's a little bit longer, you have a different stiffness. So you have some release of strain energy, etc. So this J integral, which is the energy release rate, again, the J integral finds a variation in crack length with the change of potential energy when you have a fixed displacement condition. And this is what I was trying to show here. The variation in the energy is something which is not a Newtonian force times the variation in movement of the crack tip, because you could think of this as the work is the force times the distance. Is that clear? Try to make the analogy where we know the work is the force times the distance, where the force is the Newtonian force, the distance is the movement, but I claim, or Onsager and others have claimed, that we also have a J integral, which you multiply the J, which is the so-called force, times the variation from movement to the crack tip. And this all makes sense mathematically. You just have more degrees of freedom. J integral, of course, just give a little bit of a plug to, again, the champions of all of this. J integral was attributed to Jim Rice in '67. Cherepanov actually developed something in '66 in Russia. Eshelby, of course, developed all of this stuff in the '50s when he was looking at energies of basic point defects in the solid state. For those of your students, I would encourage you to read Eshelby's papers. They're all gems, really beautiful papers, really good mathematically and good physically. But it turns out that this all comes not only from Eshelby and from Rice and Cherepanov, but it goes back not to these three men, but it goes back to a woman. Right? This goes back to Emmy Noether. So Emmy Noether was a great mathematician in the 1800s. She never got an academic job for obvious reasons in Europe. Very chauvinistic. So she wrote this beautiful paper. It's known as Noether's theorem, which has enabled a lot of theoretical physics and a lot of things. Actually, she ended up finally with a faculty job at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania, right? It's a very small school. Einstein actually said something once. He tried to say something nice, but he actually, I think, made a mistake. He said she was one of the greatest mathematicians, women mathematicians in history, but I claim she was one of the greatest mathematicians. We didn't have to stick in women, right? But anyway, so her theorem is that every differential symmetry of the action of a physical system has a corresponding conservation law. The action is the integral over time of a Lagrangian function from which the system's behavior can be determined with the principle of least action. And the J integral is nothing but one of those conservation ideas, these path-independent integrals which are invariant. And again, it's really related to Noether's theorem. Interesting enough, when I was a student, the person who told me what the theorem was actually Tablichko, was the computation, right? He understood the history of mechanics quite well. Right? So anyway, again, so the idea is, why do we want to calculate the J integral? So J integral, again, is you evaluate it through energy arguments, and you go through all this formal stuff that Fermi said, without understanding perhaps the exact thing that's happening, but you calculate it through a logical and consistent framework, and you say, I calculate something J, the Eshelby driving force, the configurational force. In words, that's the pain that the material feels near the crack tip as you load it with this sharp crack. And then you do an experiment to measure the critical resistance of the material called the fracture toughness, which is how much pain it can take before the crack propagates. So we want to know what this thing is by doing an analysis, so we can relate it to a material property, so that when we know what this is, relate it to the loads, the crack length, whatever, we can determine whether the crack will propagate. Okay, very important though. I'm going to show you now there's a physical force. I could skip all of this and show you, I could pull down the zipper in my pants and then you'll get it in a second, but let me go through all the mathematics first, okay? Because the zipper is the best way to show this. So the idea is, if you take a contour and draw a free body diagram around that crack tip, right? There's no force acting on that free body diagram. It's basically a static problem in elasticity, everything. The sum of the forces on all the pieces of it are zero. So if you would draw a little free body diagram around here and calculate all the tractions and integrate them all out, there is no net force, but I'm going to argue that there is a force. There's a force in that direction. I'm going to show you a Newtonian force that's in that direction, and that's called the J integral. What do I need it? So let me just show you something I presented here one of the last times I was here. Here's a problem that's very complicated. It has to do with bio-inspired designs. It was written before, Shio, were you born in 2000? The youngest one in the crowd here, right? But anyway, so it was a long time ago. But the idea is you have a problem where you have a bunch of, this is basically a nanostructure of a conch shell, which has a bunch of interfaces, and which crack. It's a very weak interface. When you bend this thing, all these cracks develop consecutively, and then they eventually saturate. And you want to find out, for example, one of the things we try to find out here is why nature designed all these weak interfaces. And it turns out that the driving force decreases significantly the Eshelby force as the cracks get closer and closer. In other words, if you were to design a brittle system, you had a ceramic, and you only had one crack in it versus many, many cracks in parallel to each other, which one was stronger? It turns out that when you have many, many cracks, it's much stronger. Okay? Because they shield each other, and you could show that the Eshelby driving force, the configuration force, is a decreasing function of the spacing. So the closer the spacing is, you could actually make the driving force go to zero in the limit. Okay? So how do you do that? Well, you could solve all this problem. Well, again, now you have the formalism, and you calculate it. Again, these are actually the experiments that we ran where you see all these cracks that develop and eventually saturate. The fracture toughness of this thing is about 3 orders of magnitude higher than the ceramic itself. So the idea is, if you have a crack that has all these, spacing A and crack length C, if you have an isolated crack, then the strength is inversely proportional to the square root of the crack length. And this is the fracture toughness of the material. So if your cracks get longer, it's in the denominator, the strength gets less when the crack is by itself. But if you put cracks together, you could show now through very sophisticated stress analyses or energy arguments, which take a long time, that now the strength is inversely proportional to the square root of the spacing, which means when the spacing gets small, it's in the denominator, the strength goes up. So you get a material much stronger by having many, many cracks. But now, why do we talk about all these nonsense configurational force integrals? Because they're very powerful, simplifying tools of analysis. So I'm going to get this result not through a bunch of thinking or going through equations and Fourier transforms and solving for stress intensity factors. I'm going to get it in one line using the Eshelby energy momentum tensor. Okay, and the idea I tell my students in math, when you get stuck, integrate by parts, right? You can always find the solution, right? And in fracture mechanics, if you get stuck, apply the J integral. The Eshelby idea of configuration of forces. So the idea is, if you do this, I do this for homework actually, I'll let the students do it for homework. You have the same problem where you apply loading in the far field to cracks that are spaced at S, and then the crack length is A. You do what's called a contour integral. This is the so-called Eshelby energy momentum tensor. Integrated, this becomes J, that configurational force. You write it down, don't worry where it came from, just trust me. You go through one line, you do a contour integral along here, which is this integral, you get the result in one line. Okay, so you get that the stress intensity factor goes as the square root of the spacing in one line, which means that the driving force for the J integral is a decreasing function of spacing, the material gets stronger. So you can do all this calculation, calculating the so-called, again for the 100th time, configurational force. It simplifies things. Let's look at dislocations. Dislocations, again, are basically, in terms of a picture, They were developed by Italians, no surprise there, right? Volterra and all those people, right? Somigliana, Cesaro. The idea is you take a solid and you make a cut, whether it's in this direction, you move it, or in this direction. You could take a cut on a cylinder, you could open it, then you could put like a rod in there and let it sit there. It produces stresses everywhere. Or you could make the cut and pull it out this way and push it in this way. Again, glue it together and there will be stresses everywhere. Or you can cut it and move this in that direction, tie it together, and again there will be internal stresses developed. And these are very fundamental to fracture and plasticity. Plasticity theory made a big revolution when the microscopes were developed, where you could actually see dislocations. That was only like in the 50s, basically. They basically gave us a whole new way of thinking about plasticity theory. But as John Dunders, who's a very famous statistician, would say, we didn't need the material scientists to tell us about dislocations. We could have turned the century the Italians did it, theoretically, fundamentally. They were talking about things that may be esoteric at that time, but eventually, 50 years later, they explained plasticity to the whole world, dislocation. So again, the idea is you make a cut, you put an extra half plate of atoms, like these atoms here, then you close it, and that produces stresses everywhere. That's a dislocation. Okay, that's all you need to know about dislocations. But the idea, though, is if you take a dislocation, which is this dislocation here, this is just general opening and sliding. As I said before, when you go around the contour of a free body diagram, there is no net force. There is no force on this dislocation. But there's an energetic force. Because in some situations, if you move this dislocation from one point to another, because it wants to find a lower energy state, something drove it there, which is this thing, whatever that is. And for that thing, it's called a Peach-Kohler force on dislocations. So I won't go through this. This is just some stuff that Johnny gave me. But the idea, again, is we generalize this according to Girton with this. Girton, instead of using these SUB energy momentum tensors, uses these other ideas, a generalized idea which actually applies to dissipative systems. I won't go through all the mathematics, but if you go to the paper, it explains in more detail some of the philosophy that we adopted from Morton Girton. I don't really need to go through all this. But the idea is the following then. I'm just going to summarize if you were to do an analysis. So imagine now that you have a dislocation in a half plane. So the material is here. It's a semi-infinite material, and you have a dislocation at position lambda. Okay, if you then apply the energy momentum tensor, J integral, whatever you want to apply these formal methods to this, you could calculate the potential energy in the system. And again, I skipped all the steps, but they're available. They're developed a long time ago in a very good publication by Dunders. He has all these catalogs of solutions. So if you actually calculate the derivative with respect to the movement of this location lambda, because this lambda now could go that way or that way, it turns out that this dislocation is going to be attracted to the free surface through this force. This Rx1 now is a force in a negative x direction. So there's some kind of force that's pulling that dislocation to the surface. Of course, energetically we know that. There's a lower energy state if this dislocation moves in that direction. But if you take a contour around here, there's no force. So how do we reconcile that with a Newtonian force? Well, I'll show you how. So again, the force here is this thing here. This is the Berger's vector of the dislocation. This is the lambda, which is the distance. When lambda becomes very large, of course, the force goes to zero, because when a dislocation is in an infinite material, the energy of that thing is the same as if you move it somewhere else. There's no characteristic length. So the energy is not a function of this parameter lambda. But anyway, so this is the configuration of force you could calculate to this formal approach. But now I'm going to show you what Johnny and I did, which is to show you that I could find the force in that system if I allow myself some thinking out of the box. So let's reconcile the configurational forces and practical new forces using this perturbation approach. And full transparency, we got the idea from Bigoni's work, where he said, let's imagine that sleeve being a distance delta, then calculate everything, the configuration force with that delta, let delta go to zero to the original configuration, see if the force stays in the problem, this configuration of force. Turns out that everything we did, it does. So I'll show you that now. So here's the toy model for an X dislocation. We wanted to make this problem a simple PL over EA problem, right? Simple uniaxial tension. So our toy model for dislocation is a bunch of rods in compression or tension with rollers here, constrained here. And we're going to put a dislocation here by opening this up and putting a rigid plate and seeing what we could do. Okay, so what we did is we opened it up, we put a rigid plate in there, and then we calculated formally the energy release rate, or the J integral, using this methodology of Eshelby. And then later I'm going to show it to you through a perturbation technique. So if you go through all the mathematics using the classical energetic argument, you find that even though there is no net Newtonian force in this problem, because all you have is you have this rod, which is being compressed, right? There's nothing that tends to shoot it out, right? It's just an equilibrium. You could just go to the lab and put that rod in there. It's frictionless, everything's frictionless, you put it in here, these will be compressed. However, if you use this argument by allowing the configuration to be 1 degrees of freedom, and you go through all the math, you find that there is indeed a force in the x direction, which is negative, this thing, which wants this thing to shoot out. Okay? Okay, let's see how we could think of that. So we allow ourselves to perturb it. And this is the trick. So we're doing similar to what Davi did. We're allowing now our dislocation not to be a heaviside function, but to have this path like this, different shape. It doesn't matter what the shape is because we're going to take the limit eventually. So we allow ourselves now to have a perturbed shape of my dislocation. Later on I'll do a perturbed shape of a crack tip. And now what I'm going to do, now this problem is going to have some forces that are going to have components both in the normal, in one direction and the other, because this is not being just purely compressed, right? You'll see in the free body diagram that if you solve this problem, right? This problem now has these things are frictionless. We're going to neglect all shear here. And then this thing has this component, which has an X component and a Y component. I'm going to keep track of this little baby here. And then I'm going to take the limit as this shape goes back to the original dislocation shape of the heaviside function. And I'm going to show you that that force stays in the problem in the limit, the same way as that S in Bigoli's experiment stayed as that m squared over 2b when you took the delta go into zero, the perturbation. And if you go through all the math, of course, you have to take all the solutions, the elasticity solutions of this problem. And if you go through all the math, I didn't have to do it because Johnny was visiting me as a visiting scholar, so he was like and he's very smart. He was like my postdoc before this, even though he's a very famous professor. But he had more energy than I did. I had to run the department in our company, you know what that's like, right? So we just talked about the idea that he would go back and calculate all that. So if you go through all the math, whether you go through the Eshelby approach, or whether you go to this perturbation approach, where we actually integrated the traction along here, calculated the normal and horizontal components, then we took a limit as the shape went back to its original configuration. You find this result that way, or you find it using the J integral approach, the same result if you go through all the acrobatics of using an energy momentum tensor. So this approach here is, again, this idea of using energetic ideas to calculate a force which is in the x direction, or you could do it through this free body diagram to a Newtonian force. So we showed that the Newtonian force is the same as the energetic force. Now, so this is a driving force. So going back to Raimondo's question, there is a force, but then you have this Peach-Kohler force, but the material, you have to overcome an energy barrier, right? Because it's like a friction, if you will, a glorified friction. So this dislocation, in order for it to move and be ejected, it has to overcome the barrier for dislocation moment along that plane, which is kind of like a cohesive law in shear, if you will, right? So if this thing was frictionless, of course, if this was frictionless and you made that shape, it would go out. But since you have to overcome the energy barrier, then it stays in. So again, so this is the first time, the first problem that we saw for this problem where we get the energetic force and the configuration force and the Newtonian force being the same. Then of course we just generalize this because it worked to a continuum. So now we said, let's not use this toy model of these beams in compression. Let's look at the full elasticity solution for a dislocation in the half plane. And again, as I said, we can calculate that force energetically. So what we did here then is we perturb a dislocation, which again is a Heaviside function and displacement discontinuity. We perturb it, like I said here, we perturb that shape by putting in basically a distribution of dislocations which have this random shape here. We go through all the math of calculating everything around that contour. There's one transparency issue here. In order for this to work, I have to neglect the shear along the interface. Because remember, if I include both shear and normal traction, the force is zero. It's a static problem. So I have to allow it a certain degree of freedom to allow it to move by neglecting the shear. And I'll go back to make an analogy with Prandtl's boundary later, the rationale through a fluid mechanics analogy. So we assume frictionless here, we calculate a perturbation, we calculate a normal traction, and if you go through all the math again, there's a lot of integrations to be done here, we get the Peach-Cola force. So we get the Peach-Cola force as a Newtonian force through a visualization of a perturbation where we calculate the horizontal component, take the limit. The horizontal component does not disappear even when I go to the limit of the primitive configuration. So this should give us some motivation to go on to the crack tips. So then, next thing, let me go into cracks again. Always try to, especially if you're a student, when you're trying to develop new ideas, don't start solving the complicated boundary value problems. Just like I showed you with the dislocation, we did those bars in compression. With the crack, we're doing this kind of beam spring model, double cantilever model. We show the same idea now for a crack tip. If you apply a crack, a force to a crack, which you model as these double cantilever beams with the interatomic forces or springs, you go through all the structural mechanics of this by solving the elastica. There's two things you can do. You could assume that the springs are perfectly stiff, infinitely stiff, which means that they don't open up at all, so that crack tip ends here. If you do that, you find energetically that there is a driving force, which is this classic result for a double cantilever beam, which is greater than zero, which means that there's a driving force for this crack to go in that direction. But because there's an infinite stiffness here, you can't introduce the Newtonian force. So what we said is the following. Let's perturb it. Let's assume the springs are deformable with a certain finite stiffness. Then go through the structural mechanics of calculating again on this crack now the normal, which is decomposed into a vertical and a horizontal force, solve all the elastic problem for that. Take the limit then as the spring stiffness goes to zero again, or to infinity again. It turns out that that force doesn't disappear again. It never disappears. And the idea is if you do that, you find again, this term vanishes, that the force produced by looking at a free body diagram where you calculate the horizontal component of that force, take the limit as the perturbation goes to zero, which means that you have an infinitely stiff spring, you get the same idea, F squared, L squared over EI, which is the force that you see through a simple G calculation or J integral calculation for that problem. So again, we see that if we perturb, imagine ourselves to perturb, allow ourselves to have a frictionless interface between the perturbed shape and the far field, we always get, in the limit, a non-vanishing Newtonian force, which is exactly equal to the configurational force for that paradigm of problems. Right? So, as the stiffness goes to infinity, the n goes to zero, but the r tangent theta does not go to zero, it goes to rx1. And then finally, let me just go through the same thing now if you do this with cracks. Again, you take solutions for cracks, do a crack again, and you go through all the math of the crack. There is a configurational force from the energy argument that's known as the J integral, which is equal to G, the energy release rate, which is this K squared divided by a modulus calculation. And why could I solve the spring problem before? Because if I treat this problem simply as a crack tip, there's no material of substance that I could evaluate the Newtonian force on. That's equivalent to having a stiffness in the spring which is infinite. So I allow myself to perturb it to make a certain stiffness in the system, which is non-zero. So I do the same thing. What I'm going to do now is say, well, I don't see how I can reconcile this Newtonian, or this Eshelby force, or this configurational force, with a force here, because I can't see a force. I can't calculate it on any material. The crack tip is a point, it's not a material. So I allow ourselves, to allow a process zone, if you will. Like imagine a plug of nonlinear material. It could be microcracking, it could be plasticity, which you can model perhaps as a cohesive zone. Now what I do is I evaluate again the full elasticity solution for a cohesive crack, which is not easy mathematically. I evaluate on this surface some Newtonian force. I take the small scale yielding limit where this process zone goes back to zero, and it turns out that the force, the x component of the force which is interacting between this and the far field, does not disappear, and it's equal exactly to J integral over the energy release. So physically it looks like this. We solve the problem with a generalized cohesive law. We work out all the mathematics, or Johnny did. In fact, he's very, I championed him, he's very fast. So one time we were writing a paper, and I talked to him, and I said, Johnny, by the way, we want to get this paper out, because one of our colleagues at UT Austin is doing something similar. So the next morning I saw him, he came into my office, and his hair was all of a sudden, it looked like he had the same clothes on as the night before, and his eyes were all red. I said, Johnny, what happened? You have an accident? He goes, no, I finished the paper. So what do you mean? He said, you said you wanted to get it out. I said, I meant a few months. He did it overnight. So anyway, so what the idea here is, again, we wanted to first show a sketch. This is a process zone in a material that's kind of polymeric. So the idea is the following. Because we have to have some material substance, as Girton talks about, we have to have an inhomogeneity. We want to then take this homogeneity, calculate the normal traction, find the component in the x direction to see if there's a driving force for this crack to go in the x direction. So again, this is a free body diagram of the plug. We evaluate this thing, then we break it up into this and that. So this thing here, then we take this plug, we go to the limit where the plastic zone goes to zero, right, to the crack tip, if you will, and we showed mathematically that this force in the x direction in this problem, when you take the limit of this perturbation, make it go down to zero length, is exactly the J integral, k squared over this parameter here, the Young's modulus. Okay, so again, through a free body diagram approach, which deals with so-called Newtonian forces, contact forces, in every example we gave of point defects, like dislocations, cracks, work. So when we submitted this paper, one of the reviewers, I think I know who he was, a very rigorous guy, he said, well, it's good paper, almost there. However, you did this by examples. You did it for dislocations. You did it for crack tips. Could you generalize this for any homogeneity, right? And of course, that was in the appendix of that paper. If you read the appendix of that paper, there's a lot of continuum mechanics on it, because we did what's called an Eshelby calculation. We took a general homogeneity, used the same idea, or imagine this homogeneity surrounded by a medium with this boundary layer, which has this normal traction across of it, calculate the component in, say, the next direction of the force from this thing for a general homogeneity, and lo and behold, it worked, and the paper was accepted. Okay? But finally, the last way to explain this is that. So if you want to see, you can teach fracture mechanics, and you want to show students the whole idea that a crack will extend when the energy release rate is a critical value, which is an energetic argument. G is equal to 2 gamma, or J is equal to 2 gamma. You say, you know what, I don't like energy. You know, students don't like to talk about energy, right? They like to talk about forces, they're very intuitive, right? Pretty simple. Imagine that you take a crack, which is this zipper here, and you load it this way, right? Take your zipper. I'm not going to do that here, it's being taped. Right? If I tell you to hold my zipper up, right, and then you try to open the pans, right, what would your hand feel for holding the zipper? It'll feel like it wants to open, like the zipper wants to go away from you, right? because you're holding the zipper. Somebody's opening up the pants, the zipper wants to go downward, but you're holding it. What is that force? That's the configuration force. That's the J force. So if you hold this way, and you open up, that crack wants to go that way, right? You're holding it, right? The strength of your hand is the 2 gamma. It's the energy release rate required. You say it's the energy required you have to overcome. So that's a 2 gamma. Go back to your question about friction. That would be like the resistance. So I'm holding it, I open it. If my hand is very weak, that crack will just open up because J is driving the crack in that direction. But it's driving it energetically. What we've shown the last half hour is that you could think of a force being there. But the way you could think about it is you could actually measure it in this problem. Put a load cell here. Right? Put a load cell here. Open up the zipper, hold on to it, measure how much force you're pulling, and I guarantee you it'll be equal to the JF. Is that clear? That's the idea. With that, I think I'll stop.
Thank you so much. Really enlightening presentation. But lead us to a lot of questions, a lot of doubts. Any questions from the audience?